I'm happy to say that Volume 3 of They Got Away with Murder is now published and available on Amazon. Here it is. It's in violet, which complements Volumes 1 and 2, which were in blue and grey respectively. So there you go. It's got my usual photographs and my drawings, etc. in, and the essays themselves are ones which have appeared here, suitably amended to eradicate any errors that may have arisen. Anyway, there we are. The case of Maria Clouson is a rather sad one. She left home one evening in April of 1871, thinking she was going to meet her boyfriend to discuss marriage plans. But he had other ideas. He came along with an axe.
Just before dawn, on the 26th of April, 1871, Constable Donald Gunn was walking his beat along Kidbrooke Lane in Eltham, south-east London, when he heard a faint moaning from the grass verge. There was no moon that night, but the sky was already lightening in the east, and he could make out the form of a young woman lying on her front, trying to raise her head. "Oh, my poor head, my poor head," she said in a weak voice. Constable Gunn at first thought she was drunk, but then saw blood on her right cheek, and asked her how she had come by her injuries. She turned and stretched out her hand, saying, "Take hold of my hand." Gunn received a terrific shock. He instinctively recoiled from what he described as a fearful sight. Part of the young woman's brain was protruding through the front of her forehead. The woman then fell flat on the ground, all effort gone, saying, "Let me die." They were her last words. There was a pool of blood which had clotted around the spot where she lay, and footprints as though a struggle had taken place. Her gloves lay 2 feet away, and her hat a little further on. P.C. Gunn ran to nearby Wellhall Farm for a stretcher, and there found his superior, Sergeant Haynes, doing his rounds. Upon being informed of the injured woman, Haynes went directly to Kidbrooke Lane, and was there joined by Gunn and other officers who had a stretcher. She was taken to Police Surgeon Dr. David King's house nearby, and then to Guy's Hospital in Southwark, arriving there at around 7 a.m. As light fell upon Kidbrooke Lane, Sergeant Frederick Haynes traced the footsteps he was able to discern at the scene to a nearby brook, where he found 3 spots of blood on a stone. A search was conducted, but no effort was made to preserve the footprints in the muddy ground, and these were soon obscured by a herd of policemen. A Constable Ovens discovered a silver-coloured metal whistle lying in the mud and collected this. A gardener called Thomas Lascelles also found a square piece of blue cloth nearby, which had brown stains on it, and handed this to police. But the following day, on the 27th of April, a discovery was made of great significance. Thomas Brown, a gardener at nearby Morden College, some 1.5 miles from Kidbrooke Lane, found a plasterer's hammer in the grounds, and this was handed to police. It was clearly a new hammer, had a rash of new rust on it, and traces of blood too. It had a hatchet end for cutting lath strips, and was immediately understood to be the murder weapon. On her arrival at Guy's Hospital on the morning of the 26th of April, the injured woman was treated by the on-duty house surgeon, Michael Harris. She was unconscious, very cold, and found to have suffered at least 12 severe injuries, made by a heavy and sharp implement. Her skull had been smashed, with one injury above the right eye so severe the brain was protruding from it. A cut to the upper lip extended to the upper jawbone, and cuts to her arms and hands indicated that she had tried to defend herself. In spite of the severity of her injuries, the young woman clung to the tendrils of life for another 4 days, until, at 9:15 on the evening of Sunday, the 30th of April, 1871, she died. No one knew who she was. Appeals via notices to the public, made since the morning of her discovery, had thus far drawn a blank. But 2 hours after her death, a Mrs. Elizabeth Trott visited Greenwich police station, anxious to locate her niece, who was missing. She had seen descriptions of the woman found injured in Kidbrooke Lane, and was worried. The following morning Mrs. Trott was taken to the morgue, and here she identified the dead woman as being her niece, Jane Clouson. Jane Maria Clouson was born on the 28th of April, 1854, at Deptford, London. Her father was a fisherman, and afterwards worked on boats that plied their trade on the River Thames. Her mother had died of tuberculosis when Jane was young, and she had then been in her aunt's care. Like many girls from poor families, Jane entered service at the age of just 12, first for a butcher in Deptford, and then for a sea captain in New Cross, before taking a situation with the family of Edmund Pook in 1869, when she was 15. Here she was a maid-of-all-work, at the beck and call of all in the household. It was a hard life, and she had worked here until leaving abruptly just 2 weeks before the fatal attack on her. A post-mortem was conducted by Michael Harris, and the cause of death ascribed to her extensive injuries. The clean blows to her head were thought to have been made by a hatchet-type instrument, and there was little doubt that the plasterer's hammer found nearby was the culprit. Jane had not been robbed. She had a purse on her with 11 shillings and 4 pence in it, some keys and an empty locket. Nor had she been sexually assaulted, but it was discovered that she had been 2 months pregnant at the time of her death. Given these circumstances, detectives believed she had been attacked by a lover. Police inquiries had begun while Jane lay injured in hospital. Ironmongers and hardware stores in south-east London were visited to discover if a plasterer's hammer of a description matching that of the one found in Morden College Gardens had recently been sold. It was learned that 2 had been purchased from a shop called Thomas's in Deptford High Street, one by a plasterer's apprentice on the 22nd of April, which initially misled police, and another on the evening of the 24th of April, for 1 shilling and 6 pence, by a man whom no one in the shop could recall. But as luck would have it, a shop across the road, diagonal to Thomas's, called Sparshot's, 155 High Street, reported that a man had entered the shop at 8:30 p.m. on the 24th of April, asking for a small axe for a theatrical performance. One was produced, but he said it was too big and expensive for his needs. Sparshot was able to give a description of the man and his clothes, and said he had been wearing a frock coat and billycock hat, a type of bowler hat. He had suggested to the young man that he should try Thomas's across the road, and pointed it out to him, and then stood in his doorway, watching the young man walk towards the shop. The time tallied with that at which the Thomases had sold a plasterer's hammer that evening, and so confirmed to police that the man who entered Sparshot's shop that evening was the man who had bought the plasterer's hammer at Thomas's. In addition, a woman called Lydia Cavell, who was in the Thomases' parlour that evening at around 8:15 p.m., said she saw a young man enter the shop wearing a distinctive, low, round, dark hat. She didn't see his face, but saw Mrs. Thomas take something from the window where the plasterers' hammers were displayed, and wrap it in brown paper for him. But the most important information came after the woman's identity was known. Jane's aunt, Elizabeth Trott, told detectives that Jane had been employed by Ebenezer Pook, a printer and stationer in London Street, Greenwich, for 23 months until 2 weeks before her death. She had also told her and her cousin Charlotte that she was keeping company with Pook's younger son, Edmund. She said she had left her employment of Pook's of her own volition, but her leaving was so abrupt they believed she had been dismissed. Elizabeth had last seen Jane on Sunday the 23rd of April, 2 days prior to the attack, when they had had tea together. At the time, Jane had been staying at 12 Ashburnham Road, Greenwich, with 2 women, Emily Woolwich, a friend, and her landlady, Fanny Hamilton. Emily Woolwich said Jane had been depressed and was often in tears after leaving Pook's employment. But all that had changed suddenly on Friday the 21st of April, when she received a letter. She became excited and promptly tore the letter up and burnt it. Jane would tell her nothing, but she sat down and wrote a letter herself, and afterwards posted it, so it was presumed that this was a reply to the letter she had received. 2 days after receiving this letter, Jane told her cousin Charlotte that she should not be alarmed if she did not hear from her for a while, because she and Edmund Pook were to elope. She also told Charlotte that she was going to meet him on Monday or Tuesday evening at Crooms Hill to make arrangements for this, and she was to tell no one. The landlady, Fanny Hamilton, also noticed the improvement in Jane's mood that weekend, and on the Tuesday evening Jane walked up Deptford High Street with her. She said Jane had been brimming with excitement, and parted from Fanny at 6:40, saying she was going to meet Edmund Pook at Crooms Hill, near Prince Arthur's house, because Edmund had made her a great promise. This was the last time she was seen by her friends. The circumstances of the purchase of the hammer and the intimacy of the dead woman with Edmund Pook, her appointment to meet him expressed to 2 women, believing herself to be about to elope with him, suggested to detectives that Edmund Pook was her lover, and he was also her killer. On the afternoon of the 1st of May, Detective Inspector John Mulvaney of Scotland Yard and Superintendent James Griffin, the divisional head of Greenwich Police, visited Pook's stationers in London Street and were shown upstairs, where Ebenezer Pook met them. They informed him of the death of his former servant, Jane Clouson, and questioned him about his son's relationship with her. He denied there had been any intimacy between his son and his servant, said Jane was a slovenly, untidy girl who had left his employment after receiving warnings 2 weeks before. Edmund Pook, who was 20 years old and the younger of Ebenezer's 2 sons, was then called up from downstairs. He was in a bright, confident mood, seemingly oblivious to the grim purpose of the detective's visit. "I am Inspector Mulvaney, and this is Superintendent Griffin," began the former. "I know, Mr. Griffin," said Edmund agreeably. Mulvaney continued in the same serious vein. "We have come to inform you that the young woman who was injured in Kidbrooke Lane and died in hospital was your late servant, Jane Clouson. We have heard that she was a sweetheart of yours, and that you have been corresponding with her." Edmund Pook was unruffled by the tenor or seriousness of what was implied. He said, "It's not true. She is nothing to me. She was a dirty girl, and left in consequence." "It is said you have written a letter to her," persisted Mulvaney. "If you have a letter and it is in my handwriting, then that will prove it," replied Pook. "You were the last person who was with her on the night when she met with her injuries. She left a person to join you on Tuesday night." "No, I can account for all my nights last week. I have not seen her since she left here. replied Pook. He then thought a moment and said, "Yes, I did though. I saw her talking to a gent in the town, and I came home and mentioned this to my brother. Ask him." Mulvaney then invited him to account for his nights on the previous week. Edmund Pook said he had been with his brother all Monday and never out of his sight for any length of time. "And Tuesday?" inquired Mulvaney. "Tuesday evening I left work at about 7 o'clock, and I went to Lewisham to see a lady." "Which way did you go to Lewisham?" asked Mulvaney. "I went through the park and across by the guns." "Which gate did you come out of?" "That by Mrs. Sainsbury's," replied Edmund. "Then that will bring you to the top of Croom's Hill, and by Prince Arthur's, where the girl told the person she was to meet you." Edmund said he had been at Lewisham railway bridge, and had stayed there for 40 minutes, but said that no one had seen him there. He had not gone into any place, and he had not met the lady either. The detectives then inquired about the clothes he had worn on the Tuesday night. He said he had worn a coat, then corrected himself and said it had been a blue frock-coat. He was asked to fetch these. He produced a frock-coat, a billycock hat, a shirt, and said he had been wearing the trousers he was wearing now. On inspection there were blood spots on the hat, and a large blood stain over 1 inch by 3/4 of an inch on the cuff of the right shirt sleeve, which had penetrated through both layers of material. When asked about this, he said he had scratched his wrist on some machinery. They asked to see the scratch. When it was pointed out to him that this was on the left wrist, he said he had probably transferred the blood to the right cuff while washing his hands. Mulvaney now indicated that the evidence against him was such that he would arrest Edmund on suspicion of the murder of Jane Clouson. "Very well," said Pook. "I will go wherever you want me to go." Inquiries concerning Edmund Pook quickly revealed he had more than one string to his bow where young ladies were concerned. A letter was found in his pocket from an aunt, the gist of which revealed he was in hot pursuit of her daughter Louisa. He had also been seeing a girl called Alice Durnford of 10 Bridge Place, Lewisham, for 18 months, without her parents' consent. It was of particular interest to police that Alice told them that his method of indicating his presence outside her house was by blowing a whistle. When shown the one found in Kidbrooke Lane, she said it looked to be the same. Furthermore, she had arranged to meet Edmund 2 evenings after the murder, on the 27th of April and the 30th of April, but on neither occasion he had used his whistle. 2 girls, Alice Langley and Mary Ann Love, said they had gone for a walk with Pook and his cousin on the Sunday, 2 days before the attack. They had met Edmund at Croom's Hill and walked to Kidbrooke Lane together. Edmund had said he couldn't see Alice on Monday or Tuesday, as he had a singing engagement in London. These were the 2 evenings on which the hammer was purchased and Jane was attacked. People who had been near the scene of the murder on the evening of the 25th of April came forward too. William Norton, a coachman, and Louisa Putnam were walking out together in Kidbrooke Lane that evening when they saw another young man and woman there, and saw them in fields subsequently. A few minutes later they heard screams, but thought they sounded like a couple engaging in lovers' play. William Norton described the man as wearing a dark coat, low hat, and being clean-shaven. He fixed the time as being after 8 p.m. because he had earlier seen the Magdalen College clock. Louisa concurred with this. He and Louisa said a little while later they saw the young man running alone past them towards Magdalen College. Another man, William Cronk, a gas-fitter, said he saw a young man and a woman together in Kidbrooke Lane that evening, and thought the woman seemed to be saying, let me go, or let us go. After this he saw them walk towards Eltham. He said the man was about 5 feet 6 inches tall, wore a dark frock-coat and billycock hat. The woman was about 5 feet 3 inches tall, and was wearing a dark dress and a bonnet. he was able to pick Edmund Pook out from a lineup of 15 or 20 men at the police station. He said the time at which he had seen the couple was approximately 8:45 p.m. These sightings seemed to place Edmund and Jane together at Kidbrooke Lane at between 8:15 and 8:45 on the evening of the attack. There was one other witness of the couple's presence near the scene of the crime. Thomas Lascelles lived and worked as a florist in Kidbrooke Lane. He said he had known Pook by sight for 18 months and saw him at about 6:50 p.m. on the 25th of April in Kidbrooke Lane. He had his arm around a pretty, good-looking woman, he said. He picked Edmund Pook out in a lineup without difficulty. His timing was, however, at variance with the time given by the others who claimed to have seen Edmund and Jane in Kidbrooke Lane. Nevertheless, all of these witnesses were sure they had seen Edmund Pook and Jane Clouson near the scene of the murder on the evening it was committed. But there was more to come. John Thomas Barnes, a pawnbroker of 25 Nelson Street, Greenwich, said he had walked with Miss Priscilla Billington up Royal Hill, where they met Louisa Billington. He said he saw Pook walking fast downhill, and said that 5 minutes later he heard the clock strike 9. Priscilla Billington confirmed seeing Pook at around 8:50 p.m. She said she knew him by sight and saw him running in the road. He looked rather red in the face. And Ellen Plain, of the confectioner's shop at 11 Royal Hill, said she had known Pook for 18 months and that he came into the shop sometime in the middle of April between 8:30 and 8:45 p.m., rather hot and excited. She inquired its cause. He told me he had run from Lewisham Road and asked me for the loan of a brush, she said. He used it to clean mud from his trousers, bought some lozenges, and then left. Louisa Billington, in the shop at the same time, agreed with this, and said it was either a Tuesday or Wednesday. He was in an excited state, and was perspiring heavily. She said it was cold that evening, but the streets were dry. There was no mud anywhere, so it was surprising his trousers were muddy. She recalled it was the day Benjamin Carr Dixon came into the shop. Benjamin Carr Dixon said he was in the shop on the evening of the 25th of April. He said he saw Pook saying good night as he left at about 9:15 or 9:20 p.m. Thus, in spite of discrepancies in timing, his account fixed those of Thomas Barnes, both Billingtons, and Mrs. Plain to the evening of the 25th of April, on which they had seen Edmund Pook excited, out of breath, and muddy. This was the evening on which Jane Clouson had been murdered. The various items found were passed to Dr. Lethby, the foremost analyst at this time, and he conducted examinations on the hammer and Edmund's clothes. He confirmed the presence of blood and broken hairs which matched Jane's on the hammer, and discovered another hair which matched Jane's pressed into Pook's trousers, but he hadn't been given the blue square of cloth for examination, an oversight. This was the evidence against Edmund Pook, and it was the gist of that heard at the coroner's court which produced a verdict of murder by Edmund Pook, and at the magistrate's court which committed him for trial at the Old Bailey. No defence was offered on either occasion, the case being reserved for the trial. The trial of Edmund Pook began on the 12th of July, 1871, before Chief Justice Sir William Boville. The Attorney-General, Sir John Duke Coleridge, and Harry Poland appeared for the Crown, and Sir John Huddleston, instructed by Harry Pook, who was no relation of the Pook family, in spite of the name, appeared for the defence. From the outset it was clear that the judge was hostile to the prosecution. He interrupted Coleridge's opening speech even. When Coleridge spoke of Edmund's lies to the two girls, regarding his being unable to meet them on the night of the murder because he had a singing engagement, Boville interrupted, saying, "He may have intended it." Coleridge said, that is for the jury to decide. It was a herald of things to come. Beauville harried and hectored the prosecution and its witnesses in an extraordinary fashion, but it was the police for whom he reserved his greatest ire. They would be accused of incompetence, malice, dishonesty, and lying during the trial, most unjustly. The witnesses were heard as they had been in the magistrates' and coroners' courts. Gunn on the finding of the body, Haynes on his role at the crime scene. And then came the crucial witnesses, Elizabeth Trott, her daughter Charlotte, Emily Wallage, the friend, and Fanny Hamilton, her landlady. Their testimony relating to what Jane had told them, to the letter she received, to Jane's change of mood upon receiving it, to her saying she was walking out with Pook, saying she was meeting him at Croom's Hill on the evening she was attacked, and that they planned to elope and marry, was the heart of the case against Edmund. And none of it could be heard. The defence objected to it as being hearsay. The girl who was alleged to have spoken such words was dead, and therefore could not be examined as to whether such words had been spoken or not. The prosecution argued that this testimony should be allowed on the basis that it was spontaneous utterance made by the dead girl, made without thought, to 4 different people, in one case simply to explain to Fanny Hamilton the reason for her sudden departure. But the judge ruled against it. Precedents cited were swept aside. It was a fatal blow to the prosecution. There was now nothing linking Edmund to Jane Clouson other than her having worked as a servant in his house. There was nothing to suggest he had any romantic involvement with her, no inference from this to suggest he was the father of her unborn child, no suggestion that he had been going to meet her when she had been murdered. Without this, the essential link between the two, designating motive and deliberate opportunity, had gone. So had powerful inferential evidence placing him at the scene and in her company. All that remained was the claim that Edmund had been seen in the area around the time of her death, had been observed running from that direction and subsequently cleaning mud from his clothes in the confectioner's, and a man resembling Edmund had purchased the murder weapon the evening prior to the attack. And it was these claims the defence now attacked in its cross-examination of the witnesses. 2 extraneous prosecution witnesses, called only with reluctance by the Crown, who gave fantastical accounts for reasons best known to themselves, served only to further deplete the Crown case. Edmund's claim that he had run from Lewisham, not Kidbrooke Lane, having been waiting for Alice Durnford, formed the basis of the defence case, and the defence solicitor, Harry Pook, had been busy here. On the 9th of July, just 3 days before the trial began, he found 3 witnesses, Joseph and Mary Eagles and William Douglas, who said they had seen Edmund Pook leaning on the railway bridge at Lewisham that night. Mrs. Eagles said she observed him there for 40 minutes, and that she and her husband had discussed the matter on his return home. They had picked Edmund out from an album of photos solicitor Harry Pook had shown them. William Douglas, the Eagles' lodger, supported their claims in perfect tandem with their accounts. They all denied in cross-examination that they had conferred in the matter of their accounts. There was one other defence witness, Eliza Ann Merritt, who said she had known Edmund all her life, and she had passed him on the street in Lewisham that evening. The prosecution poured scorn on these witnesses who had been discovered so recently and so conveniently. They had not come forward at any point before the trial, nor at any time since Edmund's arrest. They appeared like rabbits from a magician's hat at trial. But the heart had gone from the prosecution. The case was lost. It had become a labour of futility for them. The defence thumped home its case with conviction. The judge's summing up lasted over 6 hours, and was damning for the prosecution, for the police and their witnesses, Justice Bovell expressed the hope that 2 of the Crown witnesses would be prosecuted for perjury. He roundly condemned the police, and especially the 2 senior officers, Superintendent Griffin and Detective Inspector Mulvaney. There was no doubt about his opinion that Pook was innocent either. He said the failure to submit the blood-stained blue cloth found near to the scene to Dr. Lethby was a neglect of a clue which could have led to the real murderer. The evidence of a hair discovered by Lethby on Pook's trousers, which matched Jane's hair, was irrelevant. It could be anyone's, he said. There was no motive for Pook to kill Jane. He doubted all prosecution witnesses and lauded the defence ones. The police had misled the jury, he said, and were willing to sacrifice the life of an innocent man. It was as excoriating a summing up as it was outrageous and inaccurate. The jury was out for just 20 minutes before finding the defendant not guilty. This was greeted by rapturous applause in court. Not everyone joined the rapturous applause of those in court, whose ranks were swollen by the supporters and friends of the Pook family, which included the press. Ebenezer Pook had many friends in the industry, had worked as a compositor for the Times for 23 years before setting up on his own account. Many of the ordinary people of southeast London were angry. That night, in the streets of Greenwich, thousands gathered in force and marched on London Street to the home of the Pooks. Here they hurled abuse and expressed their outrage that Edmund Pook had been acquitted of the murder of his servant. These were the working classes of southeast London. They did not share the values of the middle classes, of those who employed servants and regarded their rights as subordinate to their own. Moreover, they believed that Edmund Pook was Jane's murderer. They were right. We are not bound by the laws governing hearsay evidence, nor are we directed by a judge in what we must think and believe and accept. We are entitled to regard all features and evidence in the case, heard or not, as grist to our mill, and this gives us an entirely different perspective on the murder. The facts against Pook are telling. 1. Edmund Pook was in a sexual relationship with Jane Maria Clouson, because she said so. Why would she lie? It was a matter of pride and excitement to her that it was so. She went further than this. She said he was going to marry her, and they were planning to elope. It had altered her mood so completely just days before her murder that it would be incredible if her account were not true. 4 people independently said it was so. If it was hearsay, then it was hearsay that demanded to be heard. 2. Edmund Pook had made Jane Clouson pregnant. We know it because she admitted she had engaged in improper relations with him, said he had made her a great promise. There is no reason to disbelieve her. 3. She received a letter from Edmund Pook on Friday the 21st of April, 4 days before her death. It must have been from Edmund because the foregoing points make that conclusion irresistible. It was the only letter that she is known to have received, and following this she told her cousin Charlotte that she was to be married to Edmund, would go away with him. She would not hear of her for a while, and then she destroyed the letter and wrote one herself and posted it. This was the only means by which an assignation with her lover, whom she said was Edmund, could be arranged. Her reply was her acquiescence to the plan, her agreement to meet him at the time and place he had appointed for their rendezvous. She told Fanny Hamilton this, as she parted from her breathlessly at 6:40 p.m., the evening she was attacked. Everything in her actions was ingenuous. She had no reason to lie, and she didn't lie. 4. Edmund bought the murder weapon. He sought a small, inexpensive axe, and, unable to obtain one at Sparshots, was directed to Thomas's across the road. Here he bought a similar implement, a plasterer's hammer. We know this because he was recognized by Sparshot as the man who had sought the axe and went to Thomas's intending to purchase this the evening before the murder. He picked him out, too. Mrs. Olivia Cavell corroborated this indirectly because she saw a young man of the same description buying something which Mrs. Thomas fetched from the window where the hammers were kept at this time. From this we may know that the hammer was purchased on the evening of the 24th of April, that it was bought by the killer, and that Edmund was the person who bought that hammer. 5. Edmund was in the vicinity of Croom's Hill at the time Jane Clouson left to meet him, though he said he had been en route to Lewisham. To be at the place at which Jane said he had arranged to meet her at that time is so forceful a circumstance that in conjunction with all the other corresponding elements it cannot be assigned to chance. It substantiates the veracity of the statements Jane made to the 4 women, which were not heard in court. 6. Edmund alone, or with Jane, was seen by several people in the vicinity of Kidbrooke Lane, by Norton and Louisa Putnam, by Thomas Lascelles and William Cronk. Apart from Norton and Putnam, the courting couple, none of these people knew each other. All gave independent witness to Edmund or Edmund and Jane's presence at Kidbrooke Lane that evening. The timing given by Thomas Lascelles was a problem. His testimony was good and was not much shaken by the defence, yet he was sure that the time he saw the couple was 6:50 p.m. This contradicts the testimony of the other witnesses because it is 2 hours earlier. But it is impossible for Edmund to have been there at 6:50 p.m. because he was still at home at that time, and it is impossible for Jane to have been there at 6:50 because she was just leaving Fanny Hamilton and heading for Croom's Hill at this time. Lascelles' testimony in terms of time must therefore be wrong. It seems probable he confused 6:50 and 8:50, possibly by observing 2 different sets of couples on the same evening. 7. A whistle found at the crime scene was like one Pook used to summon Alice Durnford for their trysts, and yet on the following Thursday and Sunday, when he called for her, he no longer had this whistle. It was found in his drawer by his brother Thomas after the evidence had been heard in court, and his brother wrote to him from Maidstone jail, exhorting him to find the silver whistle. Unsurprisingly, he did. Of course, a thorough search by police of Pook's room and the premises would have prevented this subterfuge. This made it highly likely that the whistle was Edmund's, which also placed him at Kidbrooke Lane. 8. Edmund's alibi that he had been at Lewisham was surely a false one. He didn't meet Alice Durnford, he hadn't made an appointment for a meeting, and he wasn't expected by her. Eliza Ann Merritt didn't meet him that evening because he had said he had seen no one he knew, and she came so belatedly with this vital account of their meeting that it was clearly solicited of her. Nor did the Eagles and William Douglas see him at the railway bridge, because they were found over 2 months after they claimed to have seen him, and yet had perfect recall of the matter. And their identification was based on a supposed album of photographs, which included a photo of Edmund Pook. Who was in these photographs from which Edmund was selected? No one knows. It offered no kind of acceptable evidence of identification. Why would these people lie? Probably for money. In a pamphlet written that same year on the matter, this was all but suggested by its author. There was nothing other than Edmund Pook's word that he visited Lewisham that night. 9. Edmund Pook was seen running down Royal Hill between 10 and 20 minutes after the murder was committed, by 3 people. It would have taken him this long to run from Kidbrooke Lane. He told Mrs. Plain at the confectioner's he had run from Lewisham. He subsequently said he had run because he feared he would have a fit. That is hardly believable. Why, then, In such fear of imminent collapse would he have delayed at a confectioner's shop. He said his purpose was to remove mud from his clothing, but it had been dry for several days. The streets from Lewisham did not have a trace of mud, but Kidbrooke Lane, near to the brook, and sheltered from the sun and wind by high hedging, did. 10. And then there is the matter of Pook being called up by his father to speak to detectives. He was bright, cheerful. That is a very improbable thing. For 30 minutes his father had been speaking with detectives, one of whom he knew to be the most senior officer in south-east London. The other was from Scotland Yard. But he was apparently smiling, as though his father had called him upstairs to pass the time of day with them. "I know, Mr. Griffin," he said cheerfully. Their faces told the serious purpose of their visit. It should have caused trepidation, but he was prepared for this. He knew it was coming, and they soon told him their purpose. Jane Clouson, who had been the family servant for 23 months, was the murdered girl from Kidbrooke Lane. He had been there with 2 girls and his cousin just days before. Placards about Greenwich had been seeking urgent information on the injured woman, who now turned out to be his servant. And his response to this staggering news, whatever he may have thought of Jane Clouson, was placid. There was no surprise, no shock. He was prepared for it. During those appeals, while she lay dying in Guy's Hospital, he was the only person in London who knew her identity. And he knew why the detectives were here, too. When it was suggested by them that he had been her sweetheart, he denied it, not with astonishment, but with the memorably unflattering, "She was nothing to me. She was dirty, and in consequence of this she left." When it was pointed out to him that he had written a letter to her, he was unperturbed. "If there is a letter, and it is in my handwriting, then that will prove it." How did he have such confidence in the matter? Because he had asked Jane to burn the letter and tell no one, and he knew he had such control over her that she would do it. 11. There was blood on Edmund's right shirt cuff. A scratch, he said, and blood on his hat. From a fit 2 weeks before, he claimed. Did the blood flow upwards after his fit? It was asked. Blood spots on the lower part of his trousers, particularly the right, too. But his coat was clean. At first he said he had worn a coat, but then changed this to say it was a frock coat. It invites the suspicion that he was wearing a coat, but had to dispose of it because it was too bloodied to recover. The blood on the right lower leg and his right cuff and hat are suggestive of a weapon being swung by a right-handed man, his right leg advanced, and drops of blood being deposited on his bowler hat as they flew. 12. An attempt was made, the surgeon said, to obliterate Jane's face so that she was unrecognizable. Who but her lover would wish to do this? It could only be Edmund Pook, whom she was known to have been associated with. All of these things point in one direction. Edmund Pook. Who else could it have been? Another lover? One who looked like Edmund, dressed like him, knew Kidbrooke Lane like Edmund, was in the area like Edmund, had blood on his clothes like Edmund, had mud on his trousers like Edmund, and who knew Jane Clouson, and had the dissolute nature to make her pregnant like Edmund surely did, and whom Jane Clouson told 4 different women separately, was Edmund Pook. It is obvious, surely, that this person was Edmund Pook, not some surrogate. These factors place him at the murder scene with the murder weapon which he had purchased the evening before, with an urgent motive and intention to murder Jane Clouson. We may not know it in exact terms, but we know what happened. We know Jane was pregnant. The Pooks discovered this and threw her out. Did they know Edmund was the culprit? Probably not. Jane was in a bad way. Her claim to have left the Pooks of her own choice was untrue. She said this because she feared telling people the real reason. She had been dismissed because she had disgraced herself by becoming pregnant. She was 2 months pregnant and obviously knew it. Mrs. Pook might have learned of it by morning sickness or some other telltale sign. Jane was depressed, tearful. It was a terrible situation for an unmarried young woman to be in. She wrote to Edmund. She was, at this time, still 16 years old, and Edmund now knew he was in a difficult position. If his parents didn't know, they soon would. He was bound to a girl for whom he cared nothing. That part of his statement to detectives was true enough. She is nothing to me. She wasn't. He was actively pursuing Alice Durnford and Louisa, walking out with Alice Langley to Kidbrooke Lane just 2 days before the attack. He had taken advantage of his position with the servant girl, and now there was a price to pay, one he was unwilling to pay. She loomed like a spectre over him and his future, and so he decided to rid himself of her, permanently. He wrote to her exhorting her to keep their secret. He fully intended to take care of her. They would elope, he said. They would be away some time to allow his family to reconcile to the matter. It was imperative that she tell no one about her condition, or about him, or their plans. They would meet to make arrangements at the top of Croom's Hill at 7 p.m. Tuesday, the 25th of April. She must destroy this letter by burning it. When she received this letter, in Emily's presence, she was elated. Her mood changed. She would not, as she feared, have to work in a factory, or worse. She would want for nothing, because Edmund promised her the earth, and she believed him because she was 16 years old. She turned 17 as she lay in hospital, dying, on the 28th of April. Her excitement was apparent to all who saw her. She did her best to keep quiet, to keep the secret Edmund had urged upon her, but she couldn't help herself. She told Charlotte not to worry if she didn't hear from her for a while, because Edmund and she were running away together. She told Fanny Hamilton, when they walked that evening, that she now had to leave her to meet Edmund to arrange their marriage. She had no notion that Edmund was planning to murder her. He clothed his deception in a secret elopement. Elopements require such secrecy, but so do murders. When Edmund met Jane Clouson, he will have asked her did she destroy the letter, because this was important to him. He could not allow any link between himself and Jane to be discovered, and she will have reassured him. She had torn it into pieces and then burnt it, as he had told her to do. Thus far his plan was intact. They passed people as they headed for Kidbrooke Lane, but he kept his head down. He knew the loneliness of the place at this time of year, when it was still muddy, before the summer dried the place, and it became popular with lovers in the warm evenings. He had walked this exact way with his cousin and 2 girls just 2 days earlier, something of a recce visit. By then his plan was already fully formed, because he told the girls he couldn't see them Monday or Tuesday. Monday he was procuring the weapon. Tuesday he was employing it. What conversation passed between Jane and Edmund on the long way to Kidbrooke Lane is beyond us, but he was quite decided in the matter. He had the place picked out. A plasterer's hammer was concealed beneath his coat, while she talked of marriage, the future, their family. And he smiled at her, acquiescent, spiteful with loathing. And when the moment came, he hit her. Perhaps she screamed. The screams heard by Norton and Louisa Putnam may have been her cries for help, or they may have been unrelated. She may have seen the hammer, seen it fleetingly, when it was too late to do anything about it, because she put up her hands in defence. Edmund Pook hit her repeatedly. She fell to the ground, and he continued to hit her as she lay on the floor. He was certain she was dead. Who could have survived those blows from the business end of the plasterer's hammer, which penetrated her skull so that her brain protruded from it? He ran to the brook 300 yards away to clean his hands and face in the water, sluiced his hammer too. He got mud on himself. He then ran. He was seen running. He ran all the way to Magdalen College. His head was down, his hammer concealed beneath his coat. He tossed it in the gardens and continued upon his way, now his heart hammering with the thrill of terror and exertion. He didn't stop until he came to Royal Hill, where he was seen by several people, but he had mud on him and blood. He entered the confectioner's and asked for a brush to clean himself. He was perspiring heavily, and to their queries regarding this, he said he had run from Lewisham. It seemed odd. It was odd. He brushed his clothes off and bought some lozenges. He feared no fit. There was no cause for urgency here, only one of flight, the parching fear of discovery. He then walked home, where he had supper, we are told, although the events at home can never be accepted at face value. Such private family accounts and alibis are devalued by the ties of loyalty. He rid himself of his coat and cleaned anything else he noticed. The bowler hat was not obvious. He didn't notice the lower legs of his trousers either. The next day he watched for news on the familiar placards by which the police proclaimed an atrocity in Victorian London. But here he was surprised. An injured girl was in hospital following an attack in Kidbrooke Lane. Police wanted information from anyone who might know anything. His mind raced. How was it possible she had survived? He had seen her injuries. Might she wake from her unconscious state to say, "It was Edmund Pook"? He lived with that fear for 4 days, girded himself to this possibility, and then the detectives came. He was having lunch at the time, but apparently the family were told Scotland Yard detectives had arrived to see Ebenezer. He now prepared himself. He knew why they were here. A quick rehearsal, an actor centering himself before he walks on stage. What might they say? He climbed the stairs and greeted them with a smile, and they began, "I'm Inspector Mulvaney of Scotland Yard, and this is—" "I know, Mr. Griffin." He beamed, as though this was a social visit. It was misplaced, his calmness, miscued. It didn't fit with the occasion. "The woman injured 4 days ago is your servant, Jane Clouson, and she is dead." What greater shock could there be to wipe the smile from a young man's face, even if innocent, especially if he was innocent, to make his jaw drop and his eyes stare in bewilderment? But there was nothing of this. "We are told you were her sweetheart," continues the inspector. "She was nothing to me. She was dirty," he says disparagingly, contemptuous in his effort to distance himself from her. It is not how we speak of the dead. The detectives would have seen this, seen the unnatural calmness. "It is said you wrote her a letter." "If it is so, and the letter is in my handwriting, then you will have a proof," he says with perfect equanimity. His eyes are gloating now. He might as well say, "Prove it." They cannot. Justice Beauville, in his summing up, says the letter never existed. It was a device invented by the police to entrap an innocent young man. That is an outrageous falsehood. The letter has been spoken of in evidence he has himself refused to allow. Its existence is inferred by the actions of Jane and by those who attest to them. Beauville does not see the monstrous irony of this. Many decades later, the prosecutor, Harry Poland, stated in his memoirs that Coleridge and himself were in no doubt that Pook murdered Jane Clouson, that he owed his acquittal to the weak-minded Sir William Beauville. Indeed. For 5 days after the trial ended, the Pook house was under siege from the people of Greenwich and south-east London. A low-class mob, said the Times disparagingly. Editorials thundered at police inaction over the righteous fury of the mob, who brought an effigy to London Street of Edmund Pook with a hammer raised above a cowering figure of Jane Clouson. a pamphlet was published called The Eltham Tragedy Revisited by Newton Crosland, a successful wine merchant and husband of Mrs. Newton Crosland, a Victorian novelist, who spoke for many in London when he said the trial had been mishandled by Beauville, the police maligned, and that Edmund Pook had got away with the murder of Jane Clouson. A series of litigations were brought by the Pook family against Newton Crosland and against his publisher and sellers of his pamphlet throughout 1871. They eventually petered out, but they did one useful thing. They shifted public opinion decisively against Pook. George Lewis, solicitor, defending Crosland and others being sued by the Pooks, did what no other lawyer at trial could do. He introduced the hearsay evidence in defence of the libel suits against his clients. The courts and the public now heard what Beauville had refused to allow, that Jane had confided to others she and Edmund were to elope, that she and Edmund were to be married, and that she was to meet him the evening of the murder. Though the libel cases were won by Pook, they gave him small change in comparison to the £10,000 he was seeking in damages. That's about £1.5 million in 2024. He got £50, not enough to cover his legal expenses, and the pamphlet written by Newton Crosland continued to sell. There can have been few after this who believed Edmund Pook was innocent of the murder of Jane Clouson. He could never be retried for murder, but the truth, which is important, was now known. Edmund Pook lived in Kent for a few months until the public ire had subsided. Then he returned to the family firm in London Street. He married the daughter of a printer in 1881, and they had one child, who died in infancy. They continued to live in Greenwich until the early 1900s, when they moved to the Channel Islands. After his wife died in 1915, Edmund returned to London, to Croydon, and it was here he died in 1920, at the age of 69. A few months after the trial had ended, a public meeting was held at the Greenwich Lecture Hall by those who felt Jane's death was an injury to them all. The hall was filled, and thousands of Londoners contributed the pennies they could afford for a memorial stone to be erected for Jane Clouson, a servant girl who died just 2 days after her 17th birthday. It was the least they could do.